So let's continue on. Still in Just and Unjust Wars, Part 3, the War Convention, WC. This video and the next one will be on Chapter 9, Non-combatant immunity and military necessity. Now, in the War Convention, okay, so now we're dealing with hostilities have broken out, and so what kind of rules, ethics are going to start applying here? Well, War Convention, what have we done throughout history? What are some of the ideas that have been built up? So Walzer is going to examine a couple of things. Well, the first two principles. Principle one, soldiers are liable to attack. They can be attacked at any time. And principle two, non-combatants are not supposed to be attacked ever, never to be attacked. Okay, seems fairly clear. Well, let's reflect a little bit more on this as we follow Walzer through his discussion. Let's look at principle one, what could be some critical reflections on it. This is the concept of the naked soldier. Now, before I get into this, just as a sidebar, have a look over here. I've identified it with a little asterisk. So X being a variable that would range over people. We'd say that people have, again, we're not making the argument. Well, it's just saying, look, people have a right not to be killed, or a right to live, a right to life. They have, in a very non-controversial sense. People have a right. You're just an ordinary person. You have a right not to be just arbitrarily killed. So what is some sort of philosophical underpinning, right? You look at notions of human rights and life, they're often bound up with concepts of preservation and ultimately grounded in some concept like dignity or personhood. And then people will argue about what exactly that means. But it's a fundamental concept that often in human rights literature to talk about, a fundamental tactic is to talk about things like personhood and dignity. And what's going on with that? Well, basically, when you say someone has the right to life, is you're really recognizing them, more philosophically speaking, as on the same ontological plane morally as yourself. You're saying, look, we're all kind of on this same plane of which we are of existence, and we exist as a certain kind of creature, and that creature has maybe something like dignity and the right to a preservation, and so the right not to be killed. It's not going to be that terribly good of an argument because it's kind of circular. You're just saying, well, a right not to be killed is a right to have, predicated on a right to dignity, and a right to dignity means, having a right not to be killed. But nonetheless, it is this notion of a fellow creature. That's important here. And basically non-threatening, peaceful, whose person is of equal value to mine. Something along those lines. And now, what's going on here? Well, really what we're doing is when we talk about people being like an enemy, right? You're putting them in a different ontological class, right? When someone is your friend, there's some kind of view of them in a sense of camaraderie. When you say, oh, that person's an enemy, they seem to lose a kind of status, right? They may have started off with it, but so saying X is an enemy, moving from here, like X being a fellow creature, it seems that X kind of loses this, right? And we're talking about not just enemy in the colloquial everyday sense, but wartime, right? Oh, that's the enemy over there. They lose this kind of right not to be killed. So how does this loss really work? Well, there's some reflections going on in this chapter about that. But what's driving everything is this pressure that Walzer talks about in various places in this chapter, namely of military necessity, and that is something that kind of comes in, and it as he says, it's a pressure on our judgments to make particular judgments in certain situations. So that's what's driving the whole thing about the killing, is this notion of military necessity. What is it? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. So what's going on in these criticisms of principle one goes something like this. Well, look, when you think about attack at any time, well, soldiers do a lot of things in terms of their behavior. And part of it is, yes, the soldier over there, the enemy, is shooting at you, trying deliberately, actively trying to kill you, get you out of the way to achieve the other side's military objectives. But soldiers on the other side also, they take a shower, they have a nap, do all kinds of things. And this gives rise to a series of reflections called kind of the naked soldier approach. In other words, this reveals the person underneath, right? That it's actually, no matter what, you can call them an enemy or whatever, but that guy over there shaving, or that enemy soldier, she's over there having a nap, or maybe, I don't know, writing a letter or an email or doing something that's non-threatening. But it's a soldier over there, and hence the concept is that when a soldier is like shaving, there's a moral thing. You shouldn't kill them. And you can look in the history of military personnel reflecting on this. And Walzer picks up people like Orwell and a variety when they just saw, well, there was just that bloke over there, and he's having a shave, and I had him in my gun sight, but I couldn't do it. I just didn't feel like, and they often say, I just didn't feel like killing that guy. He's just writing a letter home, or he's having a smoke or something, or doing something non-soldierly. So again, that's the person underneath. And we often hear, oh, well, that if we'd have encountered each soldiers sometimes, and it's often in literature, had we encountered each other outside of the battle, outside of war, we probably would have been friends. And there's lots of stories of soldiers befriending each other and things like that. So underneath it all, the naked soldier is just a person. So you could think about this. The more that you can add to this notion of, well, the naked soldier idea, this concept. Well, naked soldier. Okay, well, the soldier becomes naked when he's shaving, when she's writing a letter home or something like that. The more you add to the concept of, quote unquote, the naked soldier, which in a sense is not someone you should kill, increase the detail here, the lower you'll start lowering it. Oh, you can't kill them when they're writing letters. You can't kill them when they're shaving. You can't kill them, when they're having a coffee or a snack. And the more you would add to that, the more the fewer you would start lowering the situations in which one may legitimately kill. Okay, there's this huge list. Yeah, he's a soldier, but oh my God, there's a huge list. So as you add to the list of the this detail of the naked soldier, well, then the fewer and the more formal the fighting becomes, right? Until you basically, as Walzer says, a lot of people say this would stack the deck in favor of, very highly formalized, well-trained armies that, you have to meet at a certain place and you have to fight in a highly regular way. That links very deeply to money and power. That would really favor stronger, more economically powerful units that have created armies, right? And that's why often, the other side of trying to, decrease the naked soldier concept, right? The limit of that is kind of like guerrilla warfare. So, they say, oh, no, you can attack at any time. You can ambush and all these kinds of things. And the other side that has the money, oh, no, let's keep it like, regimented battle. We meet here and this is how we do it, and all that favors different notions of power. So the stacking the deck in terms of increasing the naked soldier thing favors power, and on the other side, it favors the weaker of the armies. Okay. Now, again, what's driving all this is military necessity. So what is this? Well, in this discussion, there's a couple of discussions of the nature of necessity. One is here, and the other one is in chapter 15. So you can have a look at his other discussion of necessity in chapter 15 under aggression and neutrality. So Walzer will return to the concept of necessity. But necessity basically, as he says here, is a code. It's really probability and risk when we talk about military necessity, because there's no real such thing, he implies, is that absolute necessity. Like, we didn't have a choice whatsoever. No, there were choices involved, and you assessed probabilities and risk, and then you said, well, that's military necessity is driving us to do that. But there are always options and choices. So it's the result of certain decisions that have been made, and different ones could have been made. So again, it's military necessity is kind of a code for probability and risk. Well, the response is basically, look, soldiers, in virtue of their very enterprise, are a class. says Walzer, how to respond to kind of this naked soldier thing. They're a class of dangerous individuals. Those people over there, they are soldiers and they are dangerous to, so that side is dangerous to this side and vice versa. They are designated as dangerous individuals. They are a fighter. If you warn a soldier, well, be careful when you go out. Like if you, yeah, so you say to a soldier, here's where the battle is, and be careful if you go outside to, look at the birds or just go for a little stroll. You could be shot, right? You shaving and whatever, somebody sees you through a window or whatever, or someone sees you out, sitting there writing or with a laptop or whatever, and you could be shot. So you're not really telling a soldier something dramatically new to them. They know they're a soldier. That's the preconceived notion. That's the whole idea of being the soldier, is you're liable to be killed because you are a soldier. So, you might warn them and say, well, there's an increased risk. There's been some snipers in the area, so there's increased risk. But basically, it's not the case that if you say to a soldier, you could be shot, they're going to look at you and go, I never thought of that, or what are you talking about? That is totally, totally out of sync, out of odds with my regular day. In that sense, that's how a soldier really is different than civilians. Like if you say to civilians, well, you could be shot, right? That's a huge kind of mind-altering experience for civilians, and they're not in that enterprise of quote unquote dangerous personnel. So they basically, so Walzer says, look, you've got the dangerous class of soldiers in virtue of their enterprise. They're fighters. They're dangerous. They really have lost this right not to be killed, right? Or this right to live. That's how you really address that. That's the way. That's what war is about. The harder case, of course, is Principle 2 with civilians. Non-combatants, civilians, okay, these are a lot of terms that people argue about the definitions of them. But roughly, what do you do about the extension of this, right? Because soldiers don't make their own guns, right? Soldiers don't make everything that they need, right? Sometimes you hear this, teeth to tail of an army, that, the teeth are kind of like, the weapons in the soldiers. That's actually a fairly small part of the organism, right? If you think of a tiger, a lot goes into a tiger that's not part of the dental structure, right? There's a lot of, there's the respiratory system, the digestive system, all kinds of things. Same thing in an army. There's a big tail following that set of teeth. And often it's civilians. So how does this, can we just say never to be attacked? Now, we're not talking about collateral damage where they happen to be hit. That's another topic. That's Michael Walzer will talk about that in later in the chapter, and I'll deal with that in the second video, the doctrine of double effect. We're just talking about direct attack. What could you ever directly attack? Well, this gets a little bit more complicated. In one sense, no, and in one sense, yes, and a rough division can be made, but even then you're going to have to go and look at the actual situation. Okay, what did I just mean by that? Well, let's roughly, here's the structure of his discussion. Civilians are indeed connected, okay? So start with that. Civilians are connected to the war effort. It is not the case that, like in the tiger, the teeth are connected to the body. How and in what way? Well, the teeth are connected to the digestive system, and the teeth are connected to the brain. So think of it that way. There are different connections between the teeth and the brain and the body and the rest of the body. Same thing. In the army, they are connected to civilians, but they're connected also, they think of them as the teeth, they're connected in different ways to the civilian population. So we're going to make different judgments, right, about the individuals, the civilians that are involved, because they're connected in different ways. Well, think of it this way. Connection, we unpack it a little bit. They supply the army. Okay, yes, because armies don't just come out of nowhere. They're connected. They're outgrowths of society. And the war effort. In two ways. First, civilians will provide things that are directly needed for fighting. So there are civilians that will work in factories, such as making guns, making bullets, making bombs, making tanks, all those kinds of things. So those would be factory workers. And I just, as an example, bomb making. Then there will be civilians who are connected to the war effort because they will be not making things that the army needs to fight, like bombs and guns, but that the army needs just to live, right? In other words, the farmers producing food for the army, right? Because the army needs its rations. So these types here that are connected in this sort of, it's a necessary way because the army wouldn't be able to fight. You can start arguing about all this if they didn't at least have to feed their soldiers. But you're not feeding the person qua soldier. You're not connected to the person qua soldier when you give them food as when you're connected to the person by giving them a gun, right? You're connected to the person giving them a gun in virtue of their being a soldier, right? In virtue of you making a gun and you hand it over to the soldier versus you growing a tomato and handing it over. You're handing it over to a person who needs a tomato to eat, to live. So in this sense, for these two connections, number two being this one of like the farmer food thing, need to live, those would be immune. But the ones that are connected, again, the civilians that are connected to the war effort in this way are connected to the war effort qua soldier, qua military, as opposed to just qua person. You give tomatoes to persons, you don't give guns to everyone, you give guns only to a subset of persons, soldiers. So qua soldier, that's why you're involved in the bomb and the gun making. Well, in this case, okay, so number two, these guys are immune. These ones are partially immune. Partially is they're partially assimilated to the war effort in a way that these aren't. They're not really necessarily in the army, but they're assimilated to the war effort when they're at work. So it might be the case that you can directly bomb a munitions factory and you will hit civilians. So in that sense, you're directly attacking civilians. But they're civilians who are at work. You can't go and just go attack them in their homes and say, well, hey, we know you're working tomorrow morning at the munitions factory. We're going to bomb you in your house tonight, because then you're just attacking a civilian, qua civilian. So there's kind of a symmetry in the logic. I can attack the other side's civilians when those civilians are directly involved in the war effort making the bombs, but I can't attack them if they're just having a sleep the night before their shift at the bomb factory. So they're partially immune. But even then you have to make some decisions, right? And Walzer goes through some historical examples. And he uses some instances from naval warfare. You know, ships that maybe have civilians on them and they're transporting, let's say, bombs, right? So they're involved in transporting the bombs or whatever. If you could stop it without attacking, without, sinking the ship or something, then that's something you would do. But maybe if you can't stop it in any other way, you figure that there's too much risk or whatever. If you tried to board a ship, you could lose a number of your own soldiers, etc., and too much risk, then you might just attack the ship, even if it had these civilian types on. So you'd have to make, as Walzer said, this is the rough kind of outline, right? And he doesn't think that you could put too fine a grain on it. And I read him as saying that it's not something you can just give a blanket sort of structure and say, oh, well, just, whatever situation you're in, just look at this chart and it'll give you an answer. No, you've got to look at the specifics. Again, he's looking at the morality, the specifics, trying to have some general kind of rough rules, and then coming up with an answer. That, once again, is an example of casuistry. It is not just a deduction where you go, oh, I've got a certain concrete situation and I find a moral principle and I just compare it to it and it just, bang, it gives me an answer by a kind of deductive process. That is a way some people do their moral reasoning, kind of in a Kantian flavor. You can plug things into a categorical imperative and turn the handle and out comes an answer. But that's a very kind of deductive model of moral reasoning. And Walzer, as I talked about in earlier videos, he says, no, we can't do that when it comes to moral reasoning about war. We have to be sort of a case-by-case, building up sorts of things and looking at similarities and patterns. And it's made, we have to make judgments. We can't get around making judgments. And we're not just making deductions. We're actually having to make judgments. Now, And so in this case here, yeah, you would have to make certain kinds of judgments of when you could directly attack, and maybe some cases you'd say no, you can't do that. You have to do something else. All right. So again, you can have a look at his specific examples. What I'm going to do though now is I mentioned in principle two, they're never to be attacked. But what about when you have something that falls under military? Like an objective that you got to get done to win the war effort. It's a legitimate military target, but you know that some civilians could be indirectly negatively affected. They could be killed. They could, have their, their water systems and things damaged, or their infrastructure damaged, causing great hardship. So in the next section, we're going to talk about principle two, with about how are non-combatants to be affected by military operations. And that will fall under the age-old notion of the doctrine of double effect, which goes way back. Aquinas, for instance, talked about the doctrine of double effect. So in the next video, we'll see what Walzer has to say about that.